New York City, the city that never sleeps, the city that often forgets you're even alive. And if you're like Claire, a 25-year-old waitress trying to chase her dream of acting, you know that loneliness all too well. There's something about being invisible in a city like this. You blend in. You're just another face in the crowd. For Claire, the city had promised so much, but it gave her nothing, except Jacob. Jacob was her only friend, her only companion. And when he went missing, that void inside her seemed to grow even larger. It wasn't the first time he disappeared for a little while, but this time, something felt wrong.
Jacob?
She checked the usual spots, like under the couch, behind the refrigerator. But there was no sign of him. No scratch of paws, no rustling in the corner. That's when she started to panic. Claire wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but tonight was different. Everything in her gut was telling her that something was off. Ten years later, Claire Hawk was untouchable. Her name lit up the Broadway marquees, her face graced TV screens, and her name was synonymous with success. That night, as the crowd roared and the curtain fell, Claire gave her final bow before retreating backstage, basking in the glow of her achievements. But the glitz of the theater couldn't drown out the shadows of her past. In the solitude of her dressing room, she sat at her vanity, peeling away layers of stage makeup. She stared into the mirror, but the woman looking back wasn't as invincible as she seemed. A sharp knock jolted her. Before she could speak, a man stepped inside. "Miss Hawk," he said, his voice calm but clipped. "I'm Detective Collins. I need to ask you some questions about an exterminator." Claire's breath caught, but her expression didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, playing dumb, her tone steady. This would have been about 10 years ago. Collins pressed, flipping through a small notepad. "An old building in Manhattan. You were living there." "I was squatting," Claire admitted, leaning back in her chair, trying to appear relaxed. "I was young, broke, chasing a dream. I'm not proud of it." Collins narrowed his eyes slightly. "Did you know this exterminator?" She shook her head, her face neutral. "No, I didn't really talk to anyone there. I was just trying to survive." Collins' presence felt suffocating, but Claire held firm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. After a moment, he nodded, thanked her, and walked out. When the door clicked shut, Claire exhaled sharply, her composure breaking, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the vanity. So what happened 10 years ago? Well, Claire was driven by an almost desperate need to find Jacob. When he disappeared from her apartment, she couldn't just let it go. Determined, she searched everywhere, digging through cluttered corners, calling out his name, and even risking awkward encounters by knocking on her neighbors' doors. But when none of that worked, her search led her to the last place she wanted to go. The building's dark and eerie basement. The basement was a suffocating void of darkness, the kind that swallowed sound and light alike. The faint glow from a single flickering bulb illuminated streaks of grime on the walls, and a trail of footprints leading to an open door. Claire followed, her heart pounding, her every instinct screaming for her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to find Jacob. The room beyond was like stepping into a nightmare. Jars lined every surface, their murky contents swirling in faintly glowing liquid. The air reeked of chemicals and something rotten, a mix that made her stomach churn. She suddenly froze when she heard the sound of a flushing toilet. The bathroom door creaked open, and out stepped the exterminator. Claire planted herself in the shadows behind a broken shelving unit. Her hands were clamped over her mouth to stifle her panicked breaths. The exterminator slumped down with a heavy yawn. Then he leaned forward and picked something up from the floor. Claire's heart froze. It was Jacob hanging limp in the exterminator's massive hand, his greasy grin revealing yellowed teeth as he brought the rodent closer to his face. Claire's scream cut through the silence. Without thinking, she grabbed a jar from the nearest shelf and smashed it across his face. The exterminator toppled out of his chair, but Claire didn't stop. Fueled by fury and fear, she pummeled him, punching, kicking, and stomping until he lay motionless on the grimy floor. It took a moment for reality to sink in. Her chest heaved as she stared at the bloodied, lifeless man. Panic set in, but Claire quickly realized she couldn't leave him out in the open. She dragged his heavy body into a shadowy corner and threw a filthy blanket over him, trying to erase any trace of what had happened. Unbeknownst to her, she wasn't alone. Hidden behind a broken shelf, a 10-year-old boy watched everything. His wide, unblinking eyes fixated on Claire as she gathered Jacob, left the building, and never looked back. Oddly enough, that same night, Claire spotted a flyer for a movie audition in Midtown Manhattan. That audition marked the beginning of her meteoric rise to stardom, a career born from saving a single New York rat. But tragically for Claire Hawk, a celebrated actress whose career began under the most bizarre circumstances, she had no idea she wasn't the only one playing a part in this twisted drama. The boy, now a man, had spent years perfecting his own performance. Bitter and vengeful, he had built his life around the memory of his father, the exterminator Claire had left behind in that basement. Taking on the role of authority, he became Detective Collins, a name and title as carefully constructed as the rage he had carried for decades. The end.